Exercise foresight, poor eyesight, couldn't fist fight, had to overcompensate. Learn to be clairvoyant, see around corners, read signals and warnings, interpret omens, respond accordingly to the
broadcast from later, live from the hyper-present Udit Vir, Valdes Sillins, Macy Sue, me, Robert Bolton. Weak signals are things we notice on the peripheries of our radar, things we don't really understand yet, but we suspect may be influential on the possible futures unfolding. We've each brought a weak signal of change. We don't know each other's weak signals in advance. We just do our best to unpack, make sense, speculate, and be reminded that we don't know anything. Valdes, what's your weakest signal?
A few weeks ago, I was really interested in finding a field guide for Flora and Fauna, but mostly Flora, around Ontario, because I'm interested in just oh yeah, there you go, Ontario birds. I want Ontario leaves and stuff. I just want to find out what I'm looking at, and there seemed to be nothing good. And then recently, this week, I discovered these things called literary field guides, and there's 3 of them so far. There's actually 2, but the 3rd one is coming out soon. And the first 2 are in southern Appalachia and then some Sonora desert. And there's a more recent one that's coming out for Cascadia, which is a bioregion that covers the West Coast, and I think it goes all the way up to Alaska and down to Oregon. Yeah,
it's Pacific Northwest.
Yeah. And I guess my signal is there's 2 sides to it. One, which is a little detail that I found interesting, and another, which is the notion, a broader notion. And the detail is that in the field guide, they're going to be using indigenous classification structures for describing the flora. So instead of the typical, I guess it's still Linnaean classification that's kind of built out of a hierarchy that's composed of species that are descended. Instead, it's going to be one that's about kin and relationships. And so things that have relation to one another will be that's where the classification will happen. So it'll be kind of clusters of things that go together, So the way that certain fungi only exist in certain trees,
Right.
Those kinds of things become the cluster through which you make these classifications, as opposed to a classification of just fungi. And then you have all your little branches in there. Instead, it'll be these cross-species clusters. And so that's the little detailed version. I don't know enough, obviously, I think, about biology to say whether that is useful or not. I kind of suspect it is from what I've read from biologists over the years, where there is a focus more on relation and less on abstract objects.
Currently it's morphology, right? It's what are features in these species that are similar, and the evolutionary path that got you to this species, as opposed to the ecosystem, which is the connecting tissue.
Yeah, exactly. I was gonna, when you said morphology, I was gonna say no, it's descendants, but I get what you're saying. And the funny thing about descendants, in terms of the history of a species, is that actually these species come into contact with one another and they morph into other forms. There isn't actually a tree structure for the descendants of species. Certain ones can come back together, especially in stuff like bacteria, where it's more easy to see, but it happens in bigger forms too. And then the other part of it was just this idea of field guides that are literary. So they have a bunch of poetic elements to them, literally they commission poems and stories from those bioregions. And I think the question here is is there a role for that kind of literariness inside of a scientific approach? And does that help you see new things? Can you use those rhetorical forms and abstractions to actually further a process that, at least in a very constrained vision of science in the last 50 years, was generally considered to be excluded from that process? So I guess that's the 2 sides of it.
I think the indigenous classification thing is really interesting, especially thinking about ecosystems and bioregions as they exist. What are the reasons why these 2 species might exist together? What do you lose out when you talk about one species of deer that lives in Africa and one species of deer that lives in Asia, and finding thinking about the connection? There is something there, obviously, but what do you miss out in thinking about the deer that lives in India and the tiger that lives in India that form a cohesive whole in terms of the ecosystem, predator-prey behavior, and so on.
What do you mean? What do you miss out?
Well, I mean, that kind of information isn't captured in the normal classification biology, right? This Linnaean classification that you're talking about. Those evolutionary pressures are not captured there, right? When you don't talk about the ecosystem. That's what I mean.
Not so snappy today.
got editing to do with that. Be snappy when we speak. Yeah, well, it's I guess one thing at a time on this one. I'm curious. So the field guides, what's the history of literary field guides, and like what form did they take, or is it just kind of intermixing these two things?
Yeah, I'm curious about that too. I don't know much about it. I mean, I know the notion of like ecopoetics emerges only in the 60s and the 70s with the rise of like, I guess it's the second wave of environmentalism in America. The first wave being more like the Sierra Club and stuff like that in the, I guess is that the 20s or the even earlier? But in any case, ecopoetics, I don't know whether there were these kind of like hybrids, like this kind of scientific guide approach mixed with a literary one. I'm actually not sure. And just speaking from personal experience, looking for like one for like Ontario or the Great Lakes region, I couldn't find anything that I was like very excited about.
There's that Poor Will's Almanac that I sent you. I think I sent this guy's very sometimes poetic observations about sort of what's, you know, just things observed in nature and what they tell you about the world. Like there is something that's like the relationship between poetry and its observation of nature and scientific observation of nature that is very similar, and the skill involved is really somewhat related. Like there's an attention to detail, just close observation, noticing what's happening that I could see. And I'm sure at a time when it was easier to be an expert in more disciplines than one, that it was probably poets and scientists were one and the same.
I'm also just curious, like, who they've picked to essentially provide these literary interpretations. Like, is it a range of different voices, or is it people that are like established poets? Like, is there that diversity in those interpretations? It also functions as almost a subjective guide. That's another added element to just knowing that place.
Wait, what do you mean by subjective guide?
It's almost like you're getting a tour of that place from somebody who has a certain context.
Yeah, because that's what I linked it to right away, was like the tradition of different like travelogues, like nature travelogues in particular. Like there's so many of those that have existed like all through at least the 20th century.
And that's the history of like natural sciences too, right? Like Darwin's like travelogues to the Galapagos and things like that.
That's a good point.
That's how it was always done.
But I guess in these ones, it's not people traveling. I'm assuming it's people writing about those regions that they're from. In terms of the diversity, like I'm not sure how to assess it. I didn't look up all the writers, but I mean, some of the people I saw in the Appalachia one, like Wendell Berry, are like well-known eco-poetic type of people. But I don't know what the range is. The ones for Cascadia, they were referencing people like at SFU and UBC. So there was that degree of spread at least.
Who do you think the audience is for this?
Me.
You.
If a Great Lakes one comes out, it's like, I'll buy you all copies. I'll be like the biggest. The thing I thought of too was like just with like COVID and just like this turn towards like local travel. And I was just thinking about that too, how we've all become like kind of unintentional like walled-in experiment for everybody, you know, like you're stuck for like 10 kilometers is your kind of like roaming distance, and you can kind of just go in that region or whatever. And to me, it's like made me much more attentive. I mean, it's like what caused in part this like desire for a field guide for Ontario that I wanted.
Is there something new happening, do you think? Was there a signal that's going to transform things in any way, gain momentum, or is it the synthesis of factors right now that makes you feel like this is relevant?
I guess I lean towards like the ecological, but I don't know if that's like a signal in the sense of like something that's all that new. There's been signs of like a shift in the sciences towards more relational ways of understanding and classifying things based on like a situated understanding of their characteristics, as opposed to like an abstract understanding in biology, at least. Like everything has to be analyzed inside of its context, inside of its environment, and what relations it has. And for that to be done, I think sometimes this more like poetic approach can be productive, because language carries so many blinders as to like how we presume to understand things. Like poetics can help you see relations where you might not have before. I think that's why there's the turn towards like the tech stuff, meaning like the
Tech, traditional ecological knowledge.
Is it ecological or environmental? Anyway, that's the gist of it.
So I think like the limits of like our ability to even perceive what's going on is kind of what I'm thinking about.
Switching frameworks, switching is always good for that. Language switching, like for just sort of seeing something you might not otherwise. I'm generally pretty interested in the ways in which science as an institution creates conventions that cause it to overlook certain things or assume like one way of observing is or classifying or whatever should be prioritized over another. And I think it creates many blind spots types of assumptions. That's definitely an interesting one, and it would be hard to say like one is better than the other. They sort of allow a different type of observation.
Yeah.
The two classification systems, one almost more comparative and one more relational, I guess.
An example that comes to mind for me the most is like Oliver Sacks's work, right? Which is like all like him like writing about different like medical and mental conditions that he's observed in his patients. But usually the way people talk about it is like talking about him kind of like going into these like really nuanced details and like describing like the feelings and like the emotional states that these patients are in, and not talking about like reclassifying. That's like the thing that's new here, I think. The value, not just in terms of expression, but also in terms of reclassification and finding new meaning.
One of the big like interpreters of Darwin, or competing interpreters of Darwin, was Samuel Butler, who was like deep into writing fiction and had like a very weird vision of evolution that's been like, at the time it was laughed at and still kind of is, but there's like elements of it that creep back into certain scientists who are studying evolution even today, trying to think through what the mechanisms for inducing fitness might be and where they come from. But he was kind of using literary forms to try to explore some of those like possibilities.
Was he like talking about like ideas of like beauty? Was that him like talking about ideas of beauty which kind of like contradict like the natural selection evolution narrative that's built up in like, Darwinian evolution?
He basically thinks there's a kind of like selective pressure that isn't just like random, that occurs through like a creativity. And I think the beauty comes in at that point. There's a kind of a teleology to evolution that's
like a natural pressure or something.
Yeah, can be easily misunderstood and mischaracterized as like intelligent design, which I don't think it is. But
one thing I wondered signal-wise is whether there's literacies around certain things and signals. I'm thinking of like JR's like literacy of supply chain as a signal, that literacy of frameworks and sort of the constraints that are imposed by language on sort of our understanding of reality as being like a literacy that more people are coming to be aware of. Because I think, if you're not in a field where you're actively spending time thinking about knowledge and how it's constructed and stuff, it's very easy to live life without ever thinking about how the systems of names that we give things influence the way we see the world and understand it. But is there some sort of growing literacy around foundational frameworks that we're taught?
I feel like if this was coming from within the scientific establishment, I would 100% say that that's a signal of what you're saying. But if this is like coming from outside of that and the audience is outside of that, then I wonder if that's actually the case.
Wouldn't the scientific establishment already be super aware of this, or would you say not? Especially with something like biological classification, I would think. Like, I feel like the arbitrariness of some aspects of it are obvious.
Yeah, but it's not that it's not useful.
Right. So they have that. That's a literacy that I would think the scientific community already has. Whereas, I mean, more like the everyday person who's not necessarily thinking about that,
right,
and hasn't had the mind-blowing like LSD experience that opened their eyes to it or something.
I mean, there's a reason why like a system of classification gets established and sticks around, right? It's because you want to like streamline discourse within the discipline.
I feel like that's one of the things that could change potentially.
Like the way it would happen is like an alternative one starts getting adopted on the side, and then there's like a natural kind of transition to it because it serves some sort of function that the other one doesn't, or like it's no longer as relevant because it's missing some important characteristic that seems to be important for the time right now.
The layperson might not even ascribe to these classification system. Like the layperson wouldn't like necessarily know this is whatever species, whatever subspecies, but it's through like artistic means that maybe they're getting a easier access or like an easier channel into understanding their environment, into having a more developed relationship with their environment.
I don't know what phylum I am. Most people already do identify flora and fauna by their common names, not their Linnaean classifications. So.
What about the format of the field guide is like part of the signal? Like, I just feel like the last 4 years, I've seen so many field guides come out. And I wonder if this is like paying attention to your local, your local environment and like having a way to like make sense of like the things around you. That's like driving it. from like field guides about like birds, network architecture in Toronto, things like that, which are like very situated and rooted in like the local ecology of like technology or like biodiversity or whatever.
And you created a field guide to the living
Yes.
planet.
Yes, which is like merging both of those in 2018, both those ideas.
So that's interesting. The term field guide is an interesting thing too. What is field in this context? Is this what you're in the field from in a research standpoint? Is the term is where it's coming from?
I think so. Like you're in it. You're in the
outside.
Yeah.
You're outside, not in digital space.
You're interacting.
In the field.
You're applying. Yeah.
It's interesting that as a genre, if we want to call it a genre, the field guide as a genre of reference material has a wholesome quality, I would say, about it, which is like wholesome has it. This is another thing. I feel like I think that might be related. I feel like there's like a kind of wholesome aesthetics way of happening right now. And field guide would be part of that.
Is it opposed to like a handbook?
Yeah, well, why do we like field guide? And it's
As opposed to playbook?
Yeah,
a playbook,
exactly.
yeah.
Playbook.
That's the opposite.
There are only two sources of metaphors, nature and sports.
But all of the sports metaphors are not originally sports. They also come from like war. Right?
Yeah.
So there's only two metaphors:
nature
and war. Yeah.
And then competition gets conflated in
both of them. Yeah.
Field guide. So the other thing I was just reminded of that's interesting is my friend Pamela Wong, a biology PhD who did research on polar bears and was tracking polar bears around in northern Canada. And she was using the method of taking samples of DNA from hair and stool of polar bears and measuring the, what are they called?
Telomeres.
Telomeres, yeah.
Yeah.
And was using that method, and basically as she was doing that and building relationships with indigenous communities there, I was finding that like elders could look at the gait of the polar bear and just as accurately or more accurately know the age of the polar bear as she could get through this like DNA analysis system that she had to go do in the lab. So they were just like looking at the behaviors, and it was like, well, there's like knowledge that they could know based on how the polar bear responds when it's like aware of people, could know how old it is. This is, I guess, one of these examples of like, why do we prioritize the like high-tech form of observation when it's like, well, clearly you can look at something and if you know enough about it, understand its age.
I think science favors like trying to determine what the underlying causal root is, right? To like why the age is what it is. But that in itself can be a flawed approach, because like, is the reason why the polar bear's age is the age it is it is it because of like whatever the number of telomeres are, or like what is that relation actually? In the end, it's all just relations, right? And you have to find out what those relations are.
Signal or noise, would it?
I think it's a signal. I'm not quite sure of what. There's like a few things. Like I think like the classification systems, like Rethinking Classification. I also like this idea of like the field guide being a popular format, literary format. So yeah, for those two reasons, I would say it's a signal of something.
Macy?
Signal also, I think, in thinking about more relational ways of thinking, again, also like the de and reclassification, and as well as just like bringing in and having more respect for Indigenous knowledge.
I'm going to say noise because I feel like all these things have been happening a long time, and I don't see this being a signal of something that's likely to change anything. It's a signal of something that I'm probably going to like read more about and think more about. So that's a valuable thing to bring to the table.
I like the idea of declassification. I know it was just like said offhand, but like it has that connotation of, especially in this age of like deplatforming, it's like, it's coming for science next, the declassification movement.
No, this would be that would be unclassification, right? Declassification is just like making something that was hidden visible, or like declassifying data.
That's what the word used to mean.
Yeah.
Oh, okay.
Declassifying would be
But yeah.
So we're reclassifying declassification to mean something else. It's a reclassification of the term.
Well, I think it carries all of those connotations, because the declassification is also, in the old sense, is also relevant, obviously, in the sense of you're bringing back something that was like forbidden in the annals of like scientific approaches and methods and whatnot, right? Which is that like you shouldn't listen to these just like elders in the field who like have.
Instead, listen to the elders in the field.
Yeah, you go back to the lab and listen to the
Yeah,
people in the coats or whatever.
Oh, I see those elders. Yeah. That's where the conflicts arose on my friend's paper. And in fact, the interesting thing about that anecdote is that now as a result of that work, her profession has become basically doing sort of a work of translation, negotiation, consensus finding, basically negotiating on behalf of Indigenous groups in Northern Canada with scientists in the government of Canada. Like those are the two parties. And she's involved in helping them understand each other. All right. So far, so good. Improving. We don't know anything. What's your weakest signal?
Did you say me?
Mm-hmm.
This is surprisingly, I think it is somewhat related to violence of signal. And it also like carries through with like some of our previous conversations around this kind of convergence of digital and biological. So the signal is about Xenobots. So it's a group of computer scientists and biologists who created this, what they call like an entirely new synthetic life form called a Xenobot, which is a living robot. Basically, they're designed through computer simulation in like game engines, basically, and implemented by bringing together these different biological tissues together and kind of stitching these together. They're living robots, which can perform activities like navigate mazes, like carry small amounts of payload through like your arteries or things like that. Which, although I don't think they've been used for like drug delivery or anything like that so far, but like that's the hope. But they're interesting to me, firstly because of the way they're made, right? So like they're using this sort of convergence of different technologies that we've all been talking about in the past. So like AI, game engines, and robotics. So they set up the environmental conditions in a game engine. And then they use this sort of like evolutionary algorithm to try out different possibilities for the shape and structure of these cells. And then the cells they use are from these frogs, and they use two types of cells. So the skin cells, which provide the rigid structure, and then the heart cells, which are like kind of like the kinetic engine with which like the robot itself can move. So aside from like the applications, which are drug delivery, they've also talked about like cleaning up microplastics in the ocean because these are tiny microbiotic creatures, is that they're also being used to study this sort of swarm behavior, right? So like how do these small little robots come together and create like an overall big kind of pattern, and both in terms of how swarm robotics can happen, but also looking at like how swarm behavior happens in animals and like in organisms and in biology as well. Mm-hmm. So how does biology demonstrate high level behavior, but through both low level rules and high level rules? And like I think the idea that's coming out of this lab is that in science, we often only focus on the low-level behavior, only the low-level rules, but we also have to look at the high-level rules. So like one quote actually that I found useful in thinking about it, this Michael Levin, who's like the scientist working on this, he says, if you wanted an anthill with 2 chimneys instead of 1, how do you modify the ants? And we'd have no idea, right? If most of science would be looking at trying to like think about constructing these 2 chimneys by like manipulating the genes or like the individual cells and the molecular structure of these ants instead of looking at like the higher level behavior. That's like where they're focusing on for this project.
So you said they're living? What does that mean?
Like the individual cells are living. And then not only are the individual cells alive and living, but they're also like almost behaving like an organism together.
Are there plans to make them reproduce and stuff?
They're looking at that, but I don't know how far along they are. They've talked about in the future, you can imagine these things reproducing. Right now, they're like very adaptive. So like you have a little robot and like you can rip it apart and it can like start like mending itself and like kind of reshaping itself and like, heal itself.
Just so I'm fully clear, when we say robot, these robots are entirely biological material?
They're entirely biological material.
We just call them robots in the sense that they're programmed.
They're designed, yeah, they're programmed.
Designed and programmed.
And they're programmed for specific behavior, or it's just...
For specific behavior, and that specific behavior is, the way it's programmed is basically creating an environment in virtual space, which is like this game engine. And then you like run this evolutionary algorithm with little units, which are these cells, and see how like different combinations and iterations of these like cells will survive in this virtual environment. And once you've figured out which ones can survive, you construct them by, growing them.
Oh, wow. I see.
You will try like different combinations and then see which ones are more fit for this virtual environment and which ones are not. And then the ones that are fit, you take features of those and combine them with others that also fit and then morph them together and see like how that kind of lineage survives and how fit it is for the virtual space. And then the ones that are the fittest, you kind of like bring them out of the virtual lab and bring them to the physical lab by putting them in the Petri dish.
In an actual Petri dish.
The other thing that he was pointing at, which I'm still kind of like trying to wrap my head around, is talking about how his conception of what DNA is and like what is slightly different from like the way I understood it before, and like kind of where the intelligence layer is within like organisms is slightly different from the way I understood it also. Like he talks about how, the metaphor that we use when we are bringing together these like computational disciplines with the life sciences is talking about the distinction between hardware and software, right? So we talk about hardware as like, the physical structure, and the software as like where the programming and the intelligence happens. And usually when we're talking about biology, we think of the DNA being the software layer. That's where like the code is, which like manifests as like form and function. And he talks about how the DNA is more about it just has a code for the hardware cells. And there's more intelligence in kind of like the connectivity of like the different hardware units. And so he says the software is actually not the DNA, it's the real-time, like the term he uses is real-time physiology. And that's like the programmable bit, is the real-time physiology and not just like the DNA. And the DNA is just like the fixed kind of logic which determines what the individual hardware components are going to be. As an electrical engineer, like the metaphor that works for me is like the DNA has like the codes to build like the resistors, the capacitors, like the different like electrical units. And the actual intelligence is like the physiology, which is like how these are all kind of routed together. Like what is like the wiring that connects all of these together? What is the circuit that we're making, right?
Does that mean that the mutations will occur like in each module as opposed to like the whole bit or whatever?
Well, I think he talks about how intelligence kind of lies at different levels, right? So there's kind of certain kinds of mutations that will happen at like the subcellular kind of like DNA level. And then there's certain kinds of like programming that would happen at the intracellular level. And the example that he gives is of this like organism called a planarium, which like you would imagine like the shape of this organism or like the morphology of this organism would be encoded in the DNA. But actually the encoding of the shape of the morphology of this organism is actually not in the DNA. It's in the electrical pattern that is generated between the different cells once they've started forming. And so like the electrical pattern says, you have like one head and one tail. But once you've understood that it's in the electrical pattern, they can actually induce a change in that electrical pattern and get it to grow like multiple heads and multiple tails. And they've done this in the lab. The takeaway for me is basically like, thinking about intelligence at multiple levels, not just at like the DNA level or whatever. And then also thinking about like this like massive convergence of technological fields in like, robotics, AI, synthetic biology, molecular biology, and then bioelectronics as well. And I think, and AI as well, of course. And like, I just feel like in the next decade or so, there's going to be like a massive transformation, like what we think is like computation from one end, and also like what is like biotechnology from the other end.
This line of work seems a gut feeling from a guy who knows nothing about anything, but it feels like this would be where we're going to learn a lot about the human brain and intelligence, and like this is maybe on the way to like cells, emergent intelligence, something that sort of like resembles a brain might be developed through a process like this, and thus will like give us a lot of insight into creating something more like a digital replication of the brain as well that can be like scaled and messed with in different ways. Like I feel like this is like a line of research where there's a lot to be learned when it comes to neuroscience and artificial intelligence.
One of the greatest natural forces is evolution, right? Which like humans didn't know how to kind of harness before, and you can in these like virtual space, like virtual environments now. Like we have a way to like tap into like this amazing like resource, which is evolution.
Yeah, in a more like testable without consequences kind of way, I guess.
Yeah, and also like having like the lifespan like multiple like generations, like rapidly condensed, in time to the digital side.
Yeah.
I'm interested in like the way it might reflect back on what evolution is, because I actually think like we don't really know as much as we think we know about evolution. I think some of these things have shown that random point mutation is not enough to explain it. That you can try to run as many simulations with random point mutation and you will not get anywhere like useful. But if you start scoping it to like a module or a morphology, the variations, then you get something useful. So this idea of like the way you described him talking about layers of evolution, I think is interesting for our own understanding of like natural forces outside of the computer program.
So about this signal and noise.
Oh, I guess signal, sure.
Macy?
Signal.
I think it's a signal. I mean, it's like, I just am interested every time there's like progress in this area. Macy, what's your weakest signal?
So I've been thinking about like personal growth a lot lately, and also just like potential of technology to facilitate like deep human connection, especially because like we've been in isolation and everyone's like zoomed out, and just like questioning whether long-term is possible to facilitate human connection through screens, and also like implications of mental health and how that can be scaled through technological means. So I came across this Swedish open source nonprofit. It's a tech platform called 29K. And the name is derived from like the concept that on average we have 29,000 days to live. So it's a free peer-to-peer personal development app. And it was launched earlier on this year. And they partnered with the Swedish government and education system to essentially scale personal development. And it uses like psychological theories and processes and methods to essentially try and instill like values of like compassion and openness to enable people to like kind of become wiser, so to say, make more mature decisions, be more empathetic, more compassionate, and as well just like in the process making mental health services and personal development free and accessible to everyone. So it says that is predicated, like the whole process is predicated on human connection. And it runs kind of on three components. There's like kind of a screening and matching of individuals based on like courses or programs that you take. And they're on things like relationship, anxiety, meaning. So in that way, it's kind of very much like a mindfulness app thing. But then it also tries to facilitate like deep, vulnerable human connection by putting you into small groups where you're meant to kind of share your raw reflection and kind of go through this journey together with each other, and then like to practice integrate new behaviors over time. So I mean, I haven't tried it. I'm just curious as to like what you guys think in terms of the ability for technology just like within the digital realm to like create the sense of safety where people are able to be really vulnerable to each other, and whether that's sustainable, whether that there would be like commitment for somebody to like continue doing this, especially with like strangers, total strangers that you don't know, and whether this might be like taking how technology is used to facilitate social connection, which so far has been, you know, more through social media, and it's like based on that like having that dopamine fill, whereas here they're trying to like instead of dopamine, they're like, can we instill or can we like have oxytocin instead, so like creating that social trust element. I don't know, what do you guys think? I haven't tried it, but it's like it has like 40,000 users now in over 150 countries, and it just launched this year.
I like the idea of a social media network based on oxytocin instead of dopamine.
Yeah,
I don't know how
I think
that
it's
would
a
possibly
smart.
work, but yeah.
Did he use
I
that
mean,
language?
Yeah, the founder is saying that technology right now is more running on dopamine, not oxytocin. That's what they're trying to do here.
Oxytocin makes you incredibly violent, actually, against those who are not in your inner circle. So that feeling of bonding between a mother and a child is also that you will like rip apart a human who tries to threaten the child,
Right.
like limb to limb. So
Like high, like in-group dynamics.
yeah, exactly.
Yeah, so maybe you're like you're very protective within that small group, and then there's just like these competing groups instead.
Which does feel like the opposite of social media today, in the sense of just like everything being open all the time and the constant effort at growing it, as opposed to caring for like the individuals within a small niche within it.
But it just feels like it's happening, this cozy.
Yeah, it's group chat, the OxyWeb.
The OxyWeb. Yeah, that's a great way to put it.
The OxyWeb's nice. I think it's like there's a bunch of things here, and there's behaviors that, you know, people do find professional mentors and mental health leadership and sort of spiritual gurus and things like that online all the time. So if this app is facilitating different kinds of relationships of this sort, like
I think it also specifically, it's saying it's kind of like anti-guru in that like no one is an expert. And so it's more about, I guess, like validation as opposed to like providing advice.
right.
Oh, group.
So it's group therapy.
Yeah.
Online group therapy.
With strangers.
Like, but it's like peer based, right?
Yeah.
It's not.
I mean, I don't know, like, would it work for you guys?
You asked earlier a question of like, do you think you can form intimacy or whatever through like other technological means? And I think like the answer is like, yes, like for sure, of course. Like I think some of the most like intense things I've had with people is like just through writing letters. Like that can be such a way to like get to know somebody in a way that you can't face to face because you have other defense mechanisms that go up and whatnot. But to actually just like a pen and a paper, which is technology, there is a way that you can get to know somebody quite well. And I think the question of does tech prevent human connection, it doesn't make sense to me. Like it's always been mediated by bits of technology, you know, like we wouldn't even have a sense of like interior self if we didn't have writing. Like
Yes.
some people make this claim that there's no like modern subject without writing, widespread literacy.
What we would also agree is that tech changes the way that you understand somebody else. And I'm sure there's some Twitter activity and stuff that gives you an idea of someone's interior mind, some involuntary ways, but it's not doing what like a novel can do, for example, or like a letter, like you're saying.
Yeah. And I think that's true, that most people deep down would feel like there's probably something wrong with the way social media works. I don't think anyone really thinks it's like a net positive per se, although there's elements.
Valis, were you going to say something about how it would work for you or not work for you? I think you pointed towards the sort of mental health therapy framing.
Oh, I don't think I want to get into that.
You don't want to get into that.
Yeah.
We have not created a safe space here.
For me, I would say that this would not work for me. It's framed so narrowly around like anxiety and crisis and mental health. And I think like it's not the right frame for me personally to like form meaningful connections with people. It would have to be something else about like a niche, like common interest or something.
Yeah.
Like this will work in terms of a framing with a therapist, but not with a peer, I think, for me.
Better to replace a therapist than a friend.
Yeah. I was just like if the point is to develop like deep, meaningful friendships, then I would, I don't know, make friends around like activities that actually I'm interested in.
And oddly enough, and I also don't think that's might work, but they're exactly saying like they're trying to create that sense of safety here that people get from therapy. And that's what makes therapy effective. Like when you are able to have a relationship with a therapist that you trust and that you feel safe with.
Mm-hmm.
And they're trying to recreate that with peers so that they're able to scale it more and make it more accessible to everyone.
Yeah. One of the benefits seems to be that you don't have to burden your friends or family with your problems. Right? Burden some volunteer.
I mean, yeah, you're burdening your...
Co-burden.
Yeah,
Co-burden.
co-burdened.
That's a good one. Good OxyWeb language. I would give it a shot mainly for that reason. It's like I don't like to bother people. I think that there's a lot of my head is kind of going to the like potential malicious, like privacy invasive things that someone might do. How like what happens if someone secretly records you revealing something, you know, things like that, blackmail. You know, I guess these things are inevitable and can be dealt with.
Yeah, are these people vetted in any way? How do you make sure that like it's actually a safe space or whatever
I don't know.
that they're claiming to be?
A star system.
It's a rating system, like a rating system.
This is like related to a couple pop culture signals, I guess. That I like this question of like, how much responsibility does one have for themselves while they're in a challenged like mental state, a weakened mental state, when you're feeling mentally, spiritually sick? How much responsibility do you take for, say, like the potential that the person you match with is going to be abusive or whatever, or the group that you're with is not going to be helpful for you, and your role in like, okay, I'm exiting this conversation versus being taken advantage of by a stranger on a platform like that. Does it make sense? Your responsibility for yourself to be the one recognizing that whoever it is you may be talking to, whether that be a friend, therapist, stranger on this application, maybe taking advantage of you, or maybe malicious, or maybe knowingly or unknowingly doing something that's going to hurt you even more, some way, harm you even more.
I understand the point you're making, and in general, I think that's like, it's both. It's usually like part of like person who's like creating the environment or the context, and it's also like the individual to like make those decisions around like how to navigate the space. But in this case, they're actually making a claim, which is that they're saying that they're providing a safe space, right? Like at least that's what I heard from Macy, which means that they must be doing something. And that's like what are they doing, and in what way is it actually safe?
Yeah, I'm curious.
They use the word crisis, but I'm assuming this isn't actually for a crisis, right?
Yeah, I
Like
feel
you
like
would
it's
go to
more,
like an actual crisis. Like why would you go to this like random peer app during a crisis?
I think it's more of just like you want to develop a certain mindset over time, and you're not in like a particularly
Acute
heightened state of
situation.
crisis. Yeah. I mean, I definitely see what you're saying in terms of like there could be a really malicious side to it.
If all you're looking for is like a deep connection with a fellow human, should it be around this framing? Should it be a dating app? Yeah, or like a friendship, just like a friendship app, like Bumble, like Friend Bumble or whatever.
I think part of the idea is as well to have like they're taking those courses or whatever that's meant to be allowing you to, I guess, be more aware of certain values or like build up certain skills within yourself, as opposed to like, oh, I just want a friend to talk to type of thing. So I think there is like that element of, I guess, almost like learning and self-education.
The part we haven't talked about, and the part that I think makes it a signal, so I'll preempt I think it is a signal, but for this specific reason that the state connection is so weird to me. This idea of like a sponsorship with the state, and this idea of like, could there be future state social media forms? What would that look like? And we don't think about it, but like there have been state media forms all throughout history, and like PBS, CBC, but there's no equivalent to like an online state social media form. And the idea that it would center on
WeChat.
WeChat. Yeah.
We actually joked about this earlier, but I was saying that Canada Post at TikTok too. Yeah. I was joking that Canada Post should rebrand and become a social media company.
Yeah.
Which I think is like, I'm still down for. I think it would be cool.
Yeah.
It changed nothing. Just a repositioning.
Just a repositioning. Yeah. It's
Totally
just like
superficial, like an internal level.
Yeah, exactly. Just do but promote like the chain letters and forwards and like all of that.
I wonder if any of the places that are like technology forward, like Finland or Estonia, have like tried anything like that. If there's any reason for them to do something like that, like have pioneered it makes sense in the mental health space, just because it's like you can obviously like reduce the costs on the healthcare system through. There's like an incentive for the state to do it, and you can increase the productivity of people to provide some kind of like a service like that.
Well, mental health is the thing where like the state is very involved, right? And health in general.
That's a really good point. Is there any sort of peer-to-peer like facilitation that states have ever done? Because that's the other part. Not only is it like a mental health service, because like lots of states have mental health services, but like this is like administered by your peers.
Yeah.
And coordinated by, which is so weird. Like, I don't know if there's anything like that.
There have been probably been like campaigns and promotion, wartime efforts and things like that. That probably result in like peer-to-peer kind of community efforts, but are like behavior is promoted by the government.
But promoted, right? It's not been not facilitated by the state.
I can't think of anything like this. There's like levels, right? I think there's things that happen at libraries for sure that are like peer-to-peer.
And it's also very localized.
Yeah,
that's the other difference. I mean, that's what's really interesting here. It's state funded and it's global, so like everyone can stand to benefit from it.
But it's state funded. Like, in what way is it state funded? Is it just like, hey,
I don't think it's like fully state funded. Also, I think it's as well funded by like certain foundations.
And which state did you say? Like, which country did you say?
Sweden.
So like they have so much like tech incubation money for like this responsible social tech for social good kind of stuff. It's just like a
happiness statistics.
Yeah, things like that. Just like generic like venture funding. Like where venture funding meets like impact investing, but from the state, which like a lot of them do.
Okay. Signal and noise noted.
I'm gonna say noise.
Nice. Why is that?
Just because I think there's been like a lot of like self-help type of apps. Like the most interesting thing about it is the peer-to-peer side, but I think people have tried it before as well.
About this, I think you said you were saying Signal before.
Yeah. For the state reason, the connection, I understand that it's just a partnership. I like got that from the get-go, but I think the signal to me would be like, what if, just that launching point for thinking, what if states could launch their own like social media platforms, and some of them like worked and started spreading, like the way Estonia's model for digitizing different functions in the government is now being spread on a consulting model where they're like helping other people set up bases on the software that they've like developed and basically just exporting it. And so this idea of like state developed wellness incentivized social media platforms, I think it's really weird, and I think it seems unlikely, and for that reason it feels like an actual signal.
I think it's a signal. I'm still not sure, like it's something I want to keep an eye on, but there's like an interesting kind of confluence of things going on here.
Maybe we just need to try it.
Yeah, try it.
What was it called? 27K?
29K.
It seems like a lot of work.
There's a hashtag for every 20 something K. Sorry.
That's also the other thing. I think it's just like, how do people stay committed?
Yeah, I'd probably rather just get a dopamine hit off of Instagram for my mental health. Broadcast from later.